Welcome to the Calm Analytics channel. This is Tizengauzen with you. Today is September 1st, and there are a lot of interesting news stories. In this episode, Putin named 2 reasons for starting the war with Ukraine, and there will also be an expose of Putin's grand lies at the summit. Meanwhile, in Russia, people have started talking about a new campaign to the west, a new military campaign. The Russian military leadership has now added the Odesa and Mykolaiv regions to its claimed territories. Meanwhile, the European Union is tired of Orbán's Hungarian veto, and now things are about to get tough for him, because he might lose his main tool of leverage. At the same time, Russia is jamming GPS and threatening the civil aviation of Europe. We'll talk about this and much more in today's episode. There's a lot of interesting stuff ahead. If you're new to this channel, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. So in just the past few days, Putin has literally exceeded his quota for lying by several months in advance, in my opinion. This happened on the eve of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit in Tianjin. As usual, Putin gives an interview to the Chinese news agency Xinhua, and there are some extremely interesting parts in this interview. So, let me quote. Putin is asked the following question. In your opinion, how should China and Russia jointly defend their shared historical memory in a situation where certain forces on the international stage are trying to distort historical truth? And Putin replies, we see that in a number of Western countries, the results of World War II are essentially being revised. The verdicts of the tribunals are being openly ignored. At the root of these dangerous trends is an unwillingness to recall the direct responsibility of the predecessors of today's Western elites for the world war they unleashed. So, basically, Putin is saying that the current Germans, for some reason, are responsible for those who started World War II. Alright, let's skip this part. This is still not the main point. Historical truth, Putin says, is being falsified and silenced to suit political interests. And here is the crowning jewel of his response. Under the pretext of alleged Russian and Chinese threats, Japanese militarism is being revived. And in Europe, including Germany, without any concern for historical parallels, they are setting a course for the militarization of the continent. Let me remind you that the biggest contribution to the militarization of the continent was made by Putin himself. Before he attacked Ukraine, the countries of the North Atlantic Alliance didn't allocate so much money for defense, didn't spend record amounts because there was no such madness. And he showed, I attacked, I started the war. That's who made the biggest contribution to the militarization of the continent. Putin, he is a skillful liar, I think, from birth. So, let's fully expose his lies once and for all. Regarding the falsification and suppression of historical memory, absolutely right. Putin is correct here. It is being suppressed. But we should clarify who is doing the suppressing, especially when it comes to that period you won't find in any history textbook in Russian schools. I'm talking now about the period from 1939 to 1941. Do you think the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, or as it's also called, the Hitler-Stalin Pact, is mentioned in Russian history textbooks? Do you think they mention the fact that the USSR and Germany signed a non-aggression pact? There was a secret protocol attached to it in which Stalin and Hitler divided the spheres of influence in Eastern Europe. Germany received part of Poland and Lithuania. And as for the USSR, it got the eastern part of Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Bessarabia. At that time it was part of Romania, so in fact there was a collusion to divide Eastern Europe, and the invasion of Poland happened in September 1939. Do you think these facts are included in their history textbooks? No, for them the war starts right away. And it's not even called the Second World War, but the Great Patriotic War. And for them it begins right away with the treacherous attack of Nazi Germany on the Soviet Union. Is that so? Of course, Putin says that the facts are being concealed and distorted, and that on September 1st, 1939, Germany attacked Poland, and on September 17th, the Soviet Union entered eastern Poland, claiming at the time that it was protecting Belarusians and Ukrainians. As a result, Poland at that time ceased to exist as an independent state. It was divided between 2 dictatorships. So who is really concealing the facts here, Putin, huh? So you can find this information in any European textbook, but you won't find it in Russian ones. It is also carefully concealed that it was Ukraine that bore the brunt, the main blow of the Nazis. By the way, I'm surprised that some songs haven't been banned yet. So Putin says, hey, let's throw some more fuel on the fire for him. Putin says historical parallels, so he's hinting, yes, there are these historical parallels. And I'm surprised at just how accurate these historical parallels are, though Putin definitely won't like them. For example, take Vysotsky's songs, which were written. This one, I think, was written in '65, the song Soldiers of Army Group Center. Vladimir Vysotsky wrote a song with these lyrics. Across the scorched plain, meter by meter, soldiers of Army Group Center march through Ukraine. And ahead of us everything is blooming, behind us everything is burning. There's no need to think. With us is the one who will decide everything for us. Vysotsky wrote this song about Wehrmacht soldiers who marched and burned Ukrainian cities. And now, if you don't say it's about the Wehrmacht, you might think, oh horror, what historical parallels are happening. You might think that now it's the Russians, and they even have a center group or grouping. How does that happen? By the way, an elderly woman was fined for this song. She played it on Victory Day, and she was fined for discrediting the army. Well, officially, it was for playing it too loudly. There you have your historical parallels. So, Putin, who talks about concealing history and tries to draw some kind of historical parallels, you can actually draw those parallels between Russia and Nazi Germany. The similarities are simply astonishing. And by the way, we are Russians. God is with us. That too, the Wehrmacht. It was written on Wehrmacht soldiers' belt buckles. We are Germans, so God is with us. And, well, in turn, of course, the Nazis took that from ancient Rome. So you see, Putin takes everything useful. He's borrowed a lot from the Nazis. But these aren't even the most deceitful statements Putin made at this summit. What do you think, according to Putin, why did the war start? Why did he attack Ukraine? Let me show you a video where he actually explains why he attacked Ukraine. Before this, there were a bunch of different reasons, and this is something new. Let's just take a brief now.
Let me remind you in this particular regard that this significant crisis did not actually arise as a direct result of the Russian Federation attacking Ukraine, but rather as a direct consequence of a political coup d'etat that occurred within Ukraine, which was unequivocally supported and actively provoked by the Western nations and their allies. And then, subsequently, by persistent attempts to suppress, with the extensive use of armed forces, the determined resistance of those specific regions of Ukraine and those courageous people within Ukraine who absolutely did not accept or support this unlawful coup.
How about that, huh? So what Putin is saying here is that the crisis in Ukraine did not arise because Russia attacked Ukraine, but as a result of a coup d'etat in Ukraine, which was supported and provoked by the West. Well, here too, the West is to blame for everything. It messed up all the stairwells, bombed Russian roads, took away sewage from Russians, and then there were attempts to suppress Donbass by force. That's just me shortening his thought. Turns out there's no war at all. Turns out it's all the fault of some so-called coup d'etat, and there were no Russian soldiers in Donbass at all, and no one annexed Crimea in 2014. See how that works? This is Putin's new version, and remember how Putin lied about Crimea, about those little green men. We're not there, no, we're not. And then, when he had already annexed it, well, he laughed, ha ha ha. Well, yes, we were there. He's a pure liar. He's a KGB moth. He lies all the time. If he's not lying, how can you tell when Putin is lying? His lips are moving. That's how you know? Oh, and let me remind you about this so-called suppression of some militia in Donbass. Why did you bomb Donbass for 8 years? A representative of the Russian security services, specifically the FSB, Gherkin Strelkov, did not hide the fact that he entered Donbass with Russian troops, and even stated that he was the very trigger for the war in Donbass. That was him. Now he's sitting somewhere in a detention center. I don't know if he's alive or not. Well, that's the fate of Russian heroes, in quotation marks, of course. In short, this is the very same Gherkin who is one of those responsible for the downing of the Malaysian Boeing MH17, for which he was subsequently sentenced to a lifetime of imprisonment within the Netherlands. I strongly believe that he will not live long enough to ever truly experience the Netherlands. They will undoubtedly ensure his demise within the confines of his very own prison cell, effectively ending his existence there. And according to Putin, there's a second reason why this war started. Do you know what it is? Let's watch this video now.
And the second significant and fundamental reason for the ongoing crisis lies squarely in the West's persistent and unwavering attempts to actively draw Ukraine into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, which, as we have consistently and repeatedly emphasized and explicitly stated over many, many years, undeniably poses a direct and undeniable threat to Russia's national security and strategic interests. By the way, as a result of the coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014, the country's political leadership that did not support Ukraine's accession to the North Atlantic Bloc, to NATO, was removed.
So the second reason why Putin started the war is the West's attempts to pull Ukraine into NATO. By the way, according to what Putin calls the coup d'etat in Ukraine in 2014, Putin says that the country's political leadership, which did not support Ukraine joining NATO, was removed. In other words, in order to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, Putin started the war. This is the second reason. But how does this relate to the idea that someone wants to pull Ukraine into NATO? Let me remind you, all countries in NATO have to vote to accept a new member. There's Hungary, for example, which won't vote in favor, and so on. Basically, at this rate, we'll build our own NATO faster than Ukraine will join. How does the fact that Putin annexed Crimea in 2014 relate to what he's saying now? How do these things even relate to each other at all? I mean, the political leadership of the country that Putin is talking about Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine who fled to Russia, taking with him entire truckloads of cash, some jewelry, and other valuables. So, this leadership of the country, it is important to emphasize that there was absolutely no illegal coup whatsoever. In fact, the widespread discontent and the significant events of the Maidan happened precisely and directly because Yanukovych, acting entirely on his own, decided that he alone, to put it mildly and quite frankly, would unilaterally change the country's established policy and completely and abruptly reverse its entire course. He decided to scrap the pro-European integration direction, and when Ukrainians found out that Yanukovych suddenly said, "We're not going to Europe at all, I don't want to," well, Putin said not to go, so we won't. We'll go over there to the customs union with Russia. That's when the students took to the streets. That's when Maidan began, and that's when it all started. I was at Maidan. I was there more than once. Everyone who says that someone there was bought or not bought, well, that's all just Russian fairy tales, because they're terribly afraid. How could that be? It turns out you actually can change the government. I mean, Russians, those who are big fans of Putin. So Yanukovych, along with his cabinet of ministers and his officials, is now living in Russia. And most of them have already taken off somewhere to the west, those who aren't under sanctions. Basically, that's all you need to know about the independence of this political leadership and whose hands they were fed from. Putin hasn't stopped trying to bring his puppet government back to Ukraine. At the start of the full-scale invasion, when Russian paratroopers landed in Hostomel so that planes could later begin landing there, the main and primary objective number one, was to seize the government quarter along with all of Ukraine's political leadership. Basically, whoever was there was supposed to be captured, and there was information that Yanukovych was already on standby in Belarus, waiting for the moment when he would be whisked back to Bankova Street and put in charge of Ukraine again. Naturally, the first step would have been to suppress all dissenters, throw them in prison, physically eliminate some of them, and so on. Well, it didn't work out for them back then, and it never will. And let me remind you, the terrible threat, the horrible threat that, according to Putin, comes from NATO, this threat is supposedly so dire that at one point, Putin himself personally asked Bill Clinton if Russia could join NATO. See, what does that say? Putin himself was pushing Russia into that abyss, wasn't he? And the main question is, if NATO is threatening you, why aren't you fighting NATO? You know, it's like back in the day when someone would call you out behind the garages near the school, waiting for you one-on-one for a fight. You show up and say, no, I don't think I'm ready for this. Give me that little guy over there. I'll beat him up instead. And then even the little guy beats you up. That's what it looks like. Why aren't you fighting NATO, Putin? NATO is the one threatening you. Go on, go fight them then. Oh, and let me also remind you about that so-called illegal coup that Vladimir Putin consistently keeps harping on about. After the Maidan elections were held in Ukraine, In the first round of those elections, Petro Poroshenko won. When his term ended, there was another election. In that election, Volodymyr Zelensky won. So Ukrainians first chose Poroshenko, then Zelensky. It seems that Putin's court historians and strategists have started to slack off. I mean, on those cue cards, you've seen them, right? He reads all sorts of nonsense off those cards. I think the font is so big that only 2 words fit on each card. So Putin named 2 reasons: a coup d'etat and someone supposedly wanting to drag Ukraine into NATO. In his view, for the war to end, the root causes need to be eliminated. What does he mean by that? Does he mean that it should be recorded somewhere that Ukraine won't join NATO, and then what? Rewind everything, bring Yanukovych back? He doesn't specify. That's typical Putin. He never says anything concrete. This way, he can stuff as many new conditions as possible into these vague demands. You see, he no longer mentions denazification or demilitarization. But many also noticed that at this summit, Putin was very friendly, hugging the Prime Minister of India and shaking hands with Xi Jinping. Although I think you saw how Putin was received compared to the other guests, there was definitely something off about it. Well, in general, they were all cooing sweetly to each other, but that's how it goes. So it turns out that the enemies of the United States are somehow starting, well, let's not say enemies, but opponents of the United States are starting to unite, while the allies of the United States are somehow becoming more divided. In other words, Donald Trump should probably pay attention to the fact that he has managed to quarrel, decided to quarrel with the allies, and is cementing the club of opponents. Well, that's what happens when your threats are just posts on Twitter or on X or on your own social network, and there's basically nothing behind them, and that's it. So are you threatening? Then hit. Carry out your ultimatum, impose sanctions. But instead, they're all just laughing over there. Now Trump will give me another 3 weeks, ha ha ha. Isn't he just hilarious? Well, there you go, that's what you get. By the way, I noticed that many heads of state arrived at this Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit with their wives. But the main champion of so-called traditional values, in quotes of course, showed up alone, as always. Does anyone understand why Putin never shows his kids, or his so-called Kabaeva, or anyone else, anywhere, not even to Russians? It just doesn't seem very traditional, does it? And let me remind you, friends, that we have a very serious enemy, so we shouldn't underestimate him. And unfortunately, he's still being given more time. But our soldiers are standing their ground heroically, not letting the Russians advance, and are doing truly tremendous work. That's why, friends, I'm asking you to support our fundraiser for one of the largest brigades, the separate Bohdan Khmelnytsky Brigade. Right now, they're engaged in fierce fighting in the Pokrovsk direction. They desperately need our help right now. In other words, they've asked us to help purchase several ATVs. We've already done something similar together before, for which other brigades have expressed immense gratitude. Let's support our fighters. Here is a direct appeal to us. Let's take a look.
The war continues to scorch our land. The separate presidential brigade is appealing to Boris Tizengauzen and the viewers of his channel with a request to provide our battalions with ATVs to carry out mobile combat missions in the Pokrovsk direction. We are sure that you fully understand the hell that is happening here right now. We all need to make every effort to preserve the independence of our country.
The link to the fundraiser is in the description of this video. There is also a link to the fundraiser in the comments. There is private, there is mono, and there is PayPal for those who want to help our soldiers from abroad. I am always immensely grateful to you, sincerely, truly. And from our soldiers as well. Right now, they need our help too. And if you happen to be watching me not on my channel, here is a QR code. It leads directly to the fundraising page. Lithuania has proposed to include in the 19th package of sanctions against Russia restrictions on all Russian banks, a ban on access to digital cloud technologies, and a ban on any cooperation with Russia in the field of scientific research. A very right decision. In addition, they requested to strengthen sanctions against Lukoil, Rosneft, Gazprom, and Novatek. Lithuania is doing a great job. By the way, while I have the chance, I want to say hello to my friends. My roots are partly from there as well. Lithuania, in fact, the Baltic countries, Latvia, Estonia, a big hello to all of you. It's a small country, but it's the homeland of my ancestors. And Lithuania. They understand that even after this war ends, nothing will change in Russia or in its aggressively militaristic approach. On the contrary, after this shameful war, Putin will really need a small victorious war, a kind of blitzkrieg, so that everyone forgets about the previous one, that is, this disgraceful war in Ukraine, and forgets the shame that Putin has fully tasted in Ukraine. And as for someone promising Putin the lifting of sanctions, that's just short-sighted, extremely short-sighted. Russia must remain under sanctions until it admits its guilt, until all those involved are punished, and until it fully pays reparations to Ukraine. Naturally, under Putin, no one in Russia is going to admit this guilt. So, it will be a long time, although maybe not that long once Putin dies, that Russia will remain under sanctions. Believe me, if tomorrow Russian television announces that Putin was actually a traitor and led the country in the wrong direction, and they repeat this message on Russian TV for a week, then in a week Russians will be calling Putin an enemy of the people. Both the Soviet Union and Russia have gone through this more than once. But it seems that Orbán has also gone too far. The European Union has begun considering abandoning unanimous decision-making because of Hungary. That is, 10 EU countries have proposed changing the decision-making process, not unanimously, but using a slightly different procedure. So how will countries vote, or how do they plan for countries to vote? So 55% will be enough if the countries that voted represent more than 65% of the European Union's population. This will take away Orbán's main trump card, the one he constantly uses to block aid to Ukraine, anti-Russian sanctions, and so on. I'm surprised that this issue is only being raised now. To be precise, it was brought up before, but they're only now starting to consider the mechanism. Really, this should have been done the very first time that this pterodactyl of peace, this lover of Russian oil, started blocking aid to Ukraine and anti-Russian sanctions. That's it. This should have been considered immediately. Well, of course, there's bureaucracy and so on and so forth. But for Orbán, if this happens, he may quickly lose his value for Moscow. In other words, the Trojan horse of the European Union will, at best, turn into a Trojan hamster. And his value will match that accordingly. This will be a blow to Orbán's influence. By the way, friends, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. It helps with promotion. And one more piece of news. Here we have outright aggression from Russia against specific European officials. The plane carrying Ursula von der Leyen was forced to land in Bulgaria using physical maps, in other words, paper ones. This happened after Russian electronic warfare systems jammed its navigation, according to the Financial Times, and the Bulgarian air traffic control confirmed this fact. They also added that since February 2022, there has been a noticeable increase in cases of GPS jamming, and lately it's been off the charts. In other words, the Russians are jamming GPS signals for civilian aviation with their electronic warfare systems. The same goes for civilian vessels in the Baltic Sea. It's important to understand that Russia has been causing trouble for a long time, and especially in the Baltic region. There is no other reason for using electronic warfare against civilian aviation and navigation except for sabotage and attempts at intimidation. In other words, Russia is a parasitic state that has learned how to create problems but hasn't learned how to solve even its own issues within its own country. That's why it's so astonishing. So when I look back, or rather when I remember, I picture that red carpet rolled out for Putin in Anchorage, Alaska, and I think Putin has killed far more people than Osama bin Laden and all of Al-Qaeda and has brought hundreds of times more grief to this world. But for some reason, people choose to engage in dialogue with him instead of smearing this moth thinly across the walls of his bunker. We are living in remarkable times, an era of deals and bargaining, an era when basic human values and moral compasses have been trampled. But it won't always be this way, believe me. The pendulum will inevitably swing the other way. And here's another interesting event that happened. Putin's court philosopher Dugin has finally lost his marbles, and he wrote a post that goes as follows. We get it, you're pretty good at fighting, but that's enough. You've proven your point, that's it. We're not each other's enemy. Let's move together against the West. We can get rid of this clown at any moment. Strangely enough, we're watching the Ukrainian people stop talking nonsense, As soon as we see the cherished sign from your side, all this scum will disappear in an instant. What, do you think we don't have the same means as Israel? It's just that our leader knows how to wait for his moment, and that moment is near. So go ahead and start, and you'll see what we can do. Ukrainians have proven that they're tough, stubborn, and foolish, but tough nonetheless. That's enough. From here on together. Oh my God. What exactly happened? The so-called utterly non-existent subhumans, a truly non-existent nation, those supposedly spoiled Russians invented by Vladimir Lenin in the year 1991, and so on and so forth. It turns out they are actually incredibly tough and resilient Ukrainians. Let's be friends. Let's attack the West together. 1 million Russians, actually more than that now, a few less alive Russians, I think, have realized just how tough Ukrainians are. And this is for our Western partners to understand how Putin's inner circle thinks. They will always need a war. Always. And a push towards the West. In other words, Dugin voiced what was Putin's original plan: to seize Ukraine, saturate it with anti-Western propaganda, eliminate those who disagree, gather an army and move on the West. This is exactly what Ukraine shielded Europe from. If Putin had succeeded, I don't know how things would have turned out. I saw polls in Germany and Poland. Many people simply said, we won't fight and we'll just move far away. So that's just for context. And here, the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Federation was also summing up the results of the spring-summer offensive for the understanding of our Western partners. We know these results, and against the backdrop of a map where they had already drawn in Odesa and Mykolaiv regions as part of their territory. Yes. By the way, I also noticed that on Gerasimov's wall there's a giant portrait of Defense Minister Belousov hanging there. Well, that's a stupid Soviet tradition, hanging portraits of your bosses. I just don't get it at all.